Hello and welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith, and today we're diving into a topic that has puzzled and provoked deep reflection for centuries, the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis 22:2. Have you ever wondered why God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, especially when he clearly condemned human sacrifice in Leviticus 18 and 20? What was this test meant to show, and what does it reveal about God's character? This is part one of a two-part exploration into Genesis 22:2. Next week, we'll continue unpacking more layers of meaning behind this incredible and sometimes distressing story. But for today, let's focus on the command itself and what it means. Let's begin by reading Genesis 22:2 from the New Living Translation, where it says, "Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you." Now, the land of Moriah was a 3-day journey for Abraham and Isaac. Imagine being in Abraham's sandals. What would you be thinking during that long walk? God, why are you doing this? After all the waiting, why ask me to give up Isaac now? And what about your promise? How can Isaac's line bring the Messiah if he's gone? The command must have been utterly confusing. Let's start by outlining the issue as noted in the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, where they write this. In both Leviticus 18:21 and 20, verse 2, God specifically denounced human sacrifice when he commanded Israel, "Do not permit any of your children to be offered as a sacrifice to Moloch." That's Leviticus 18:21. "And if any of them offer their children as a sacrifice to Moloch, they must be put to death. The people of the community must stone them to death." That's Leviticus 20, verse 2. Yet, in Genesis 22:2, God commanded Abraham to take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. This appears to contradict his command not to offer human sacrifices. So let's immediately go to the solution from the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, where it goes into great detail. So permit me to read verbatim, where they write this. First, God was not interested, nor did he plan that Abraham should actually kill his son. The fact that the angel of the Lord prevented Abraham from killing Isaac, as we see in Genesis 22:12, demonstrates this. God's purpose was to test Abraham's faith by asking him to completely surrender his only son to God. The angel of the Lord declared that it was Abraham's willingness to surrender his son, not the actual killing of him, that satisfied God's expectations for Abraham. God said explicitly, "Don't lay a hand on the boy. Do not hurt him in any way. For now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld him from me, even your son, your only son." And that's Genesis 22:12. Second, the prohibitions in both Leviticus 18:21 and 20 verse 2 were specifically against the offering of one's offspring to the pagan god Moloch. So it is not strictly a contradiction for God to prohibit offering one's offspring to Moloch and yet asking Abraham to offer Isaac to him, the only true God. After all, offering Isaac to the Lord is not offering one's offspring to Moloch, since the Lord is not Moloch. God alone is sovereign over life, as we see in Deuteronomy 32:39 and Job 1, verse 21. And therefore he alone has the right to demand when it should be taken. Indeed, he has appointed the day of everyone's death, as we read in Psalms 90, verse 10, and Hebrews 9, verse 27. Third, Abraham so trusted in God's love and power that he willingly obeyed because he believed God would raise Isaac from the dead. And we read this in Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. This is implied in the fact that though Abraham intended to kill Isaac, he told his servants, "The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." That's Genesis 22, verse 5. Finally, it is not morally wrong for God to order the sacrifice of our sons. He offered his own son on Calvary, as we read in John 3:16. Indeed, even our governments sometimes call upon us to sacrifice our sons for our country. Certainly God has an even greater right to do so. All right, back to me. That's some excellent detail and explanations. However, as one might expect, atheists have a field day with the story of Abraham and Isaac. There's a link to a YouTube video I included on the show notes. It is called Bonkers Bible Stories. And here is a summary of what YouTuber Abraham Piper said in an episode regarding this verse. He says this: "Remember that time God told Abraham to kill his son? Abraham was like, 'I'm on it.' But then God stops him, and we're supposed to be impressed by Abraham's faith and God's mercy. But you're telling this story to children, and it raises the question, if God asked, would parents kill them too?" End quote. All right, back to me. Let's focus on an important point. Our modern sensibilities are understandably shocked by the idea of child sacrifice. However, the Bible does mention such acts occurring under extraordinary circumstances, like when the king of Moab sacrificed his son in 2 Kings 3:27. Many readers often overlook this verse because the story of Elisha and the widow with the miraculous flow of olive oil, which she used to pay off her debts, comes right after it. Child sacrifice is a challenging issue, but it also highlights how crucial it is to understand the cultural and theological context of the Bible. In ancient times, the idea of child sacrifice wasn't uncommon among pagan nations, but God stops the act, demonstrating his opposition to such practices. This act sets the God of Israel apart from the gods of surrounding cultures. We will cover this in more detail shortly. I believe the best way to examine this difficult Bible story, God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, is by examining it from multiple perspectives. In fact, there are 6 different ways we can consider this story in relation to God's purpose. The first perspective is God's purpose in testing Abraham. God's command was meant to test Abraham's faith and obedience, not as a genuine request for human sacrifice. God never intended for Isaac to be killed. By stopping Abraham at the last moment, God showed that he opposes child sacrifice, setting himself apart from the pagan gods of that time. From the gotquestions.org website, we find this article, "Why did God command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac?" where they write this: God's command to sacrifice Isaac was to test Abraham's faith. God's tests prove and purify our faith. They cause us to seek him and trust him more. God's test of Abraham allowed his child and all the world to see the reality of faith in action. Faith is more than an inner spiritual attitude. Faith works, end quote. All right, the second perspective is strengthening Abraham's faith. This intense test was meant to strengthen Abraham's faith and reveal the depth of his devotion to God. His willingness to obey, even when faced with such a difficult command, demonstrated the sincerity and authenticity of his faith. Drew Zerverick, from his April 3, 2023 article, "How Could God Ask Abraham to Sacrifice His Son Isaac?" says this: God tested Abraham's faith and devotion to their absolute limits. And when something is tested to its limits and it perseveres, it becomes stronger. God, Abraham, and the world now know just how devoted and loyal Abraham is. This point is not trivial. I often wonder and hope that in the hardest of circumstances, I would remain loyal to Jesus. Would I face martyrdom for Christ? I hope and believe that I would, but it's impossible to know for certain. A test like Abraham's could bring me the blessed assurance of knowing how I would respond, end quote. The third perspective is foreshadowing Christ's sacrifice. Many theologians view this event as a foreshadowing of God the Father's willingness to sacrifice his own Son, Jesus Christ, for the sins of the world. It serves as a symbolic portrayal of a father's pain in offering up a beloved son. Also, from Drew Zerverick's article, he writes this: This story offers the world a picture of a father's pain in sacrificing his son. something that God would never actually ask humans to do. What God was unwilling to ask of humans, he was willing to take upon himself. Eventually, God the Father would endure the pain of sacrificing his own son in order to save the world, end quote. The fourth perspective is Abraham's trust in God's promise. Abraham trusted that God would somehow preserve Isaac, even if it meant raising him from the dead, because God had promised descendants through Isaac. This reflects Abraham's profound faith in God's character and his promises. Robert Roche, from his February 2021 article, "Please Explain, Why Did God Cruelly Command Abraham to Sacrifice His Son?" writes this: "In the end, it was God's promise and Abraham's faith in that promise that allowed Abraham to raise the knife over his son. In effect, Abraham was saying, 'God, I'm going to trust you.' Abraham's action on that mountain was a believer's way of confessing, 'God, even though I don't understand why you're asking me to do this, even though this is breaking my heart, still I'm going to leave the final outcome in your hands.'" The fifth perspective is differentiating from pagan practices. By ultimately stopping the sacrifice, God set himself apart from the pagan gods that required child sacrifice. Later, the Levitical laws prohibiting child sacrifice reinforced this distinction even further. Drew Zavarink, in his earlier article, shared this insight to help us better understand. The tragic truth is that child sacrifice is a tale as old as time. Almost every culture, including ancient China, ancient Aztecs, ancient Greeks, and ancient Africa, all practiced child sacrifice. He then adds, by stopping Abraham from sacrificing his son, it differentiated God's character from the character of all the other gods at that time. Abraham grows to know something that he didn't know before, that God abhors human sacrifice, end quote. And the sixth perspective is God's sovereign right. Some argue that, as the sovereign creator, God has the authority to command the taking of life, even though he forbids humans from doing so on their own. However, in this case, God did not actually permit the sacrifice to happen. This is what the Big Book of Bible Difficulties explained in their solution. I hope these perspectives give you a better understanding of why God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and why he ultimately stopped him. As we wrap up today's episode, remember that God's command was never about death. It was about faith. Next week, we'll dive deeper into the question, how could Isaac be Abraham's only son when Ishmael was also his son? It's another layer of this rich and complex story, and I can't wait to explore it with you. Until then, reflect on the faith of Abraham and consider, how deep is your trust in God's promises? Remember, studying the Bible isn't just about finding answers. It's also about asking the right questions. Thanks for listening. As always, we love hearing from our listeners. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. I'm always glad to hear from our listeners. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well. And also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.